Hello and welcome to day 7 of 100 Days of Chat. Today is March 2nd and we're talking about printers. Now I know printers might not be the most exciting topic, but I wanted to bring it up because I think it's really important to get a baseline understanding about how printers work and why you might run into some issues. Now this isn't going to be a video about troubleshooting your printer because A, that's probably not that interesting, and B, there's a million reasons why a printer can go wrong. If you've spent any time with technology, you're probably aware that two of the most frustrating things to try and deal with are network connection issues and printers. And so today I'd like to kind of demystify some of the reasons why printers can be frustrating and some of the issues that you can run into. So to get started, I want to talk briefly about firmware and software. And I'm probably going to make a video talking about hardware, firmware, and software in general, but for the purposes of this video, I'll give you a brief introduction. Software you can think of as programs that you run on your computer are classified generally as software. And that the soft in software, it indicates that these are programs that are going to be installed and removed at will based on user specifications. Some users might want some things, other users might want other, and so you can temporarily install them, uninstall them, change them as much as you want. The comparison between software and hardware is that software are programs or applications that will run on your machine or your hardware, whereas the hardware is the physical object or device. So when you talk about the computer, the processor, the motherboard, the graphics card, these are all examples of hardware, whereas things like iTunes or Internet Explorer or Google Chrome or Assault Android Cactus, one of my favorite video games to play, these are all examples of software. Now, in between hardware and software is this concept called firmware. You may have heard of it before, but it's likely that you don't really understand the concept. So to kind of explain firmware really briefly, if you think of software on one end of the spectrum and hardware on the other end, then firmware is somewhere in the middle. It's similar to software in that it usually takes the form of applications or code that are written for specific hardware, but they're designed to be a little bit more permanent. They're designed to be installed on the hardware and stay that way. They might get updates over time, but in general, you're going to have the firmware that the manufacturer of the device intended, and very often, the firmware is designed by the same people who designed the hardware. This can be because the firmware acts as a compatibility layer for the device that you're trying to use. So for example, if you want to interact with your printer's hardware, you need to send instructions to your printer that your printer will understand. And you know the software that you're using to send a print job to your printer might not know how your printer expects the commands to be sent, and so you need that firmware to be living on the printer's hardware in order to interpret the instructions and make the hardware act properly. So a little bit of a rabbit hole to go down in discussion, but the general takeaway is that software takes the form generally of applications and programs, things that you can uninstall and install, and hardware is the physical devices that you're using to run the software on, and firmware is like software in that it can be installed and uninstalled on the hardware, but it's more designed to be long-term and permanent, and more often than not, firmware will come on the hardware pre-installed. So for example, the printer that you purchase has firmware pre-installed into its processor, and if you take that printer out of the box, hook it up to the internet, and you tell it check for updates, it might update that firmware, but it's not like you're going to go pick and choose different pieces of firmware to install on your printer to get different functionality. No, rather, this firmware is more like software that's required from the hardware manufacturer in order to get the hardware to work. So maybe that's the better short answer. Software is programs and applications that you choose as the user, that you choose to install and uninstall to get different functionality, whereas firmware is programs and features that are installed onto the hardware that are built by the hardware manufacturer or someone who's working with the hardware manufacturer, and the firmware is required to make the hardware work. So why is this important? Well, printers are pretty advanced devices. If you think of a printer, you're probably thinking of the little, it's a device that has little heads that dispense ink in different places based on the instructions that you send it, and they put ink onto a page and it prints it out. And so you might be thinking of a strictly hardware model. It's just a physical device that you send instructions to, and it will just it will print out what you tell it. But that's not exactly what's going on. Sure, there is hardware there, and the print heads are printing out ink onto the paper. But when you send your Word document or your PDF or your pictures or whatever it may be to the printer, you might send it as a file, but the printer itself has a processor, and usually it's a system on a chip, so it's one piece of hardware, but your printer has a processor built into it, as well as other pieces of hardware that are similar to the hardware that's in your computer. And you can kind of think of it as the printer has, if you think about a printer as a person, right? Like, it has its hands. That the hands of the printer are the heads of the ink that physically write out. If the printer was a person, it'd be writing on a piece of paper with the ink. But that printer person has a brain inside of their head that is able to process the instructions you're sending it. But for the printer, this brain that processes the information is a processor similar to what's in your computer and your phone and everything else. So in a way, it's like there's a little computer built into your printer, and when you send a file from your computer to the printer, it's actually sending it to that little computer module in the printer to decode the instructions and figure out how to physically print. When you send a Word document to your printer, it doesn't say, okay, arm number 1 needs to drop 2 drops of ink, and then arm number 2 moves over and drops 2 drops of ink. Your computer doesn't know how to send instructions like that. It just sends the file over to the printer, and the printer's firmware and processor will take that information of the end result that you're looking for and translate that into instructions for the physical printer device to work. If none of that made sense, I apologize. Feel free to leave a comment down below, and I'm happy to explain a little bit better. But what I need you to take away from that long and convoluted discussion is that the printer has a little computer built into itself that has to decode the instructions, which means that, on one hand, it means that you can send more complex tasks. You can say, hey, here's a sheet of text, print that out for me, and it can figure it out. But on the other hand, if that little computer in the printer is having trouble understanding what you're saying, or gets confused, or the software or the firmware on that computer gets confused or is broken or corrupted, then it can cause a problem. And it might not be very obvious what the problem is. If your printer says failed to print, well, you would expect it to print out a sheet of paper with just random ink on it, but instead it's just not doing anything and saying failed to print. That's because the little processor in the printer is trying to decode the instructions, and it failed to do so in the proper way. So a lot of times what can happen is, if there's corrupted firmware on the printer, it can cause an issue. But also, sometimes your printer expects that the instructions are being prepared by software that's on your computer. For example, if you have an Epson printer, you might have installed Epson print utility software onto your computer to help the printer understand what to do, and it can send specialized instructions to the firmware on the Epson printer in a way that will be more convenient for the printer to understand, and it can save your day. But if you're not using that software, well, then you're expecting the printer to do more work on the firmware side than on your computer side. It's kind of like just sending a vague instruction like, hey, go get my groceries. To if you've got a butler, let's say, you tell him, oh, go get my groceries. He might go and get the wrong things, or he might go to the wrong store, or he might go to a more expensive store and spend too much money. But if you know how the butler's going to think and you say, okay, butler, this is the location of the store I need. This is the list of the things that I need. These are the brands that are acceptable. Purchase these, don't purchase these. If you give more specific instructions, then that butler will do a better job every single time. And so, along those lines, if you have access to software that is built by the printer manufacturer, that can save a lot of headache and can give more specific instructions that your printer will understand. So if you're having any sort of issue with printing out a document, my first recommendation would be look to see if the printer manufacturer has any software that exists out there, because that sort of software is generally pre-built to either work better with the printer or give you better feedback in telling you why there's an issue. For example, if you're trying to print a document that's corrupted, the software might tell you the document is corrupted, whereas the firmware on the printer might just say, I don't know, doesn't work. And there you don't have enough feedback to really make a difference. So with that being said, the overall ecosystem to think about is, you've got software on your computer that can help the printer, and you've got firmware on your printer. If you look for software and you can't find any software out there, or it doesn't work for your machine, well, the next step I would recommend is check the firmware on your printer. See if there's any updates. That can usually be done by navigating. If your printer has a screen and some buttons, you can go through in the settings and there will be a button for check for updates. It's pretty common that those exist. If not, you can go to the printer manufacturer website, and sometimes you can get some downloads or something where you can actually install updated firmware to the printer through a connection on your computer. Let's say your printer is connected through USB to your computer. Very often you can find some updated firmware on the manufacturer's website. You can download that to your computer, and sometimes it will just be an application that you can run that will update the firmware on your printer. But if you look for software and that doesn't help you, and you look for new firmware and that doesn't help you, and you're still having issues, well, it's either that your hardware is having an issue, which the only way to fix that is to call the warranty guys, call a repairman or go get a new printer, or looking at the way that your computer is sending the instructions. So we talked a little bit about software. I'm probably not going to talk about printer software anymore because it's either there or it's not. We talked a little bit about firmware, which we're going to talk more about, and then we talked a little bit about the hardware. Usually speaking, replacing the hardware is a last resort, and getting the software is only an option for certain manufacturers of printers. If you have a brother printer, it might not have software that can handle it and help you out. But it's important to focus around this firmware issue because a lot of times the firmware is just not that advanced, and it can't handle complicated requests, or if things go wrong, the firmware oftentimes will just give up and say, I'm sorry, I can't do that. But what you can do is you can say, well, if I can't get any software to help me out, and I don't want to buy a new machine or get my machine looked at professionally, how can I enable the firmware to do a better job at printing? That's to say, how can I take these issues that the firmware are facing and solve them myself? And that's really the core essence of trying to fix most printers. I mean, the most wide range of latitude that you have is trying to figure out ways to send instructions to the firmware that will make the firmware able to understand what you're doing a lot better. Now, granted, if there exists software made by the manufacturer of the printer, that can be a good place to start, but sometimes that won't even solve your problem. And so when you're trying to think of ways to send the information to the firmware in a way that it will decode it and process it better, it's important to talk about drivers and operating systems. Now, drivers and operating systems. Drivers is a scary word for a lot of people, and I'll kind of break down what a driver is and why it matters and how you can try and solve problems related to that. And related to that, we're going to have to talk about operating systems. So real briefly, I'm going to go over, what an operating system is. I'm going to list a couple of words here: Windows, Mac, Linux. If any of those three words stand out to you, if you have a machine that's running one of those things, that is your operating system. If you have a machine that's not running one of those things, leave it down in the comments below, because I'd be really interested to see if, some of you are watching my YouTube video on a Commodore or an Amiga machine. But generally speaking, most users are going to be on Windows and Mac, with a small minority being on Linux. I personally use Linux primarily, but most people are going to be on Windows and Macintosh. So when a printer manufacturer is making a printer, they have to design the firmware to work with the most common operating systems that are out there, with the operating systems that they expect that their users are going to use. And chances are you're using Windows or Macintosh as your operating system, so chances are that firmware is able to understand instructions that are sent from a Windows or Macintosh computer. Well, your first thought would be, okay, well, the printer manufacturer is just going to make their firmware able to communicate directly with my operating system, and so I can just send a print command from whatever program I'm using, and my operating system will send that instruction to the printer, right? Well, no. The printer manufacturer, let's say Epson, for example, they don't really know exactly how your operating system is going to send that printer instruction to the device. And in fact, your operating system doesn't really have a set standard on how they want to send information to other hardware in general, much less printers. People who are, Microsoft develops Windows because they want to build an operating system, but Microsoft, doesn't. The operating system developers of Microsoft don't want to spend a bunch of time troubleshooting printers and designing operating systems that work with printers. And so what they said is, hey, if we're just building our operating system, Windows or Mac, I'm going to build the operating system. I'm going to make it work on the computer. And what we can do is we can take a little piece of software and we can design that piece of software to take instructions from the operating system and, let's say, take that print command, like let's say you say print this PDF. Well, this little piece of software will wake up when you say print this PDF, and it will say, okay, well, what does it mean to print something? Well, here, let me write a set of instructions on how to print this PDF, and I'm going to write it in a way that the printer will understand, and then I'll send it to the printer. So let's say you have a Epson Model 7. I'm making up a number here, but if you have an Epson Model 7 printer, then let's make a little program that can interpret the print command from your operating system and then translate it into instructions that your Epson Model 7 will understand, and then send that command to the Epson Model 7. The Epson Model 7's firmware will take that instruction and say, oh, I know what this means, I know how to do this, and it will go ahead and print it out. And that's what a driver is. That little piece of software that was written to enable interconnectivity is what's called a driver. And there are different drivers for every single printer. Sometimes you can have a general purpose driver that knows how to send instructions in multiple ways, but for the most part, you should expect that every single printer has a different driver that allows it to translate the printing instructions and send it to the printer. On top of that, not only do you have a different driver for each printer, you also have to have a different driver for each operating system. Because if you have a Windows computer and a Macintosh computer, when you click, Command P or Control P or whatever you use to send your print command, If you do it on Windows, it's going to send different information than if you do it on a Macintosh, because the computers work differently, they store files differently, they process information differently. They're completely different operating systems that work in completely different ways that have been developed separately. And so it's kind of like English and Spanish. You know, if you want to translate something into French, that's great. But if you're starting in English, you're going to have a different method of translation than if you're starting in Spanish. And so you need one method to go from English to Spanish and another English to French, and then you need a different method to go from Spanish to French. And so you can imagine there's two different translation methods there. And so if you have similarly with the printer, if you have a Windows computer talking to my Epson Model 7 printer, it's going to need a different translation package or a different driver than my Macintosh computer talking to my Epson Model 7. On top of that, each individual version of Windows and the Macintosh operating system, each different version can have different drivers, and usually does have different drivers, because there will be small differences in the way that they operate, in the way they manage memory, in the way they store files, in the way they present files. And you want it to be that no matter what operating system you're on, the file always prints the same way. But if you're on a different operating system, it might be displayed a different way, it might be stored a different way, you might have different file types, different file extensions, and so you need to be prepared for all of these things. So if I'm on a Windows 7 computer versus a Windows 10 computer versus a Windows 3.1 computer, all of these are three different versions of the Windows operating system, and they all work very differently. Windows 3.1 versus Windows 10, they can't even communicate with each other except for on the most basic levels, because they're so different. So you need a different driver for each version of the operating system. On top of that, if you have something like Windows XP, there are multiple service packs, which are big groups of updates that are included in the operating system. When Windows XP released, it was, start off with Windows XP, and then after a year or a certain amount of time, there have been a lot of updates, and the people at Microsoft say, okay, well, at this point, we have so many updates that there are fundamental differences between when it was released and now, and so, it's been a couple years. Let's package this all up and call it Windows XP Service Pack 1. It's still Windows XP, but because of all the updates, it might treat your printing job a little bit differently, and so you might need a different driver for Windows XP versus Windows XP 1, Service Pack 1, versus Windows XP Service Pack 2, and so on and so forth. It can get even so granular as to be the individual version number can have an impact. Sometimes a driver, let's say, if you're on Macintosh and you have Macintosh operating system 10.05, right? Let's say you're on 10.05. Well, there might be one driver that worked on 10.0 through 10.03, and then a different driver that works on 10.04 to 10.07, then another driver that works on 10.08 to 10.10. And so that could be three separate drivers that all work on Macintosh operating system version 10, and it might not even be that they're different service packs, they're just different sequential versions. And the more you update your computer, the more likely that something will break in the way that the driver works, and you might need an update. So suffice it all to say that drivers are really helpful because they help decode the information that your computer is trying to send to your printer. But it's difficult to pinpoint the correct driver because the individual version number of your software can make a large impact on how the software has to work. And thus, when you're trying to find the right driver, it can be really difficult to find the right driver for you. And even if you pinpoint the driver that's developed for your version of software, there's a lot of hardware concerns that can make a difference in the way that these drivers work. I won't go too far into this because this isn't really a hardware channel, and I don't want to bore you with all the details. But if you're plugging a printer into your USB port, you might think, oh, USB is USB. It stands for Universal Serial Bus. Universal, that means it always works, right? Well, no. I mean, there's different types of connectors. There's USB type A, USB type B, USB type C. So if you've had the long and flat USB versus the box-shaped USB versus the rounded USB, these are all three different types of USB ports that can have different ways of communicating. And then on top of that, there's USB 1.0, USB 2.0, USB 3.0. If you look at your USB ports and you have a USB port that has a blue piece inside of it rather than a black piece, that might be a USB 3.0 port, which communicates with a different protocol than a USB 2.0 port. And there might be some fundamental difference that breaks the way that drivers work. And I'll let you in on a little secret. People who write drivers, the companies that write drivers, they make most of their money by selling products printer companies make most of their money selling ink. The device is a joke. They give you massive discounts on the device because they know you're going to have to buy ink, and that's where they make their money. They don't make any money on drivers. In fact, drivers are always published for free on the manufacturer's website. So when you're talking about, driver compatibility issues, there's a lot of these concerns that go into it and a lot of minutia, but it's all something that does not make more money for the company. So they are incentivized to spend the least amount of time and to just make it work as fast as possible so that they can make newer printers and newer ink cartridges and sell you and make more money on selling the ink rather than spending all their time developing software for the drivers. So there might be workarounds or quick fixes or quick solutions where the developer said, I could spend 10 hours rewriting this whole thing from scratch, or I could spend 1 hour and just copy the old version and throw a few duct tape fixes on here and there, and it'll work for 80% of people. If that software developer goes to his boss and says, which do you want me to do? His boss is going to say, well, we're not making any more money on these drivers, so do the quick fix and just make it work. And those 20% of people will just send them a new printer if they complain. It's likely a strategy that some manufacturer will take. And I can't speak for any of them personally because I've never worked for I've never been a software developer at a driver a place that makes drivers for printers, but I would imagine that the incentives are there to not spend as much time as possible and to just slap things together. But if you slap together duct tape fixes and just make small patches incrementally, then you'll have latent defects underneath the surface that won't really be very obvious for a long time until they break catastrophically, and then you have to invest a lot of resources to rebuild and restart. But again, these manufacturers are not incentivized to really put that much into their drivers. So drivers have a much higher likelihood of failing than, let's say, something like Photoshop, for example, where Photoshop is a piece of software that costs hundreds or thousands of dollars and can even be a subscription model. So Adobe makes a lot of money on that software, so they have the ability to spend the time and money to really, fundamentally make new changes and rewrite and build compatibility out. Whereas people who are making drivers, the hardware manufacturers who are spending time writing this firmware and these drivers, they don't have the financial incentive to spend more time making them because they're not going to make any more money if they get good drivers. So at the end of the day, why is this important to know? Well, we're talking about firmware, software, and hardware, and we're talking about printers and how they work. And so what's important to know is if your printer's not working and you don't have a software solution to fix it, remember we talked about that, and you can't, go and buy a new piece of hardware, buy the new printer, then the next step is to make the firmware understand what you're trying to do. And how do you make the firmware understand? Well, you need the best translation opportunity possible. You need the best ability to translate your instructions as something the firmware will understand. And the driver's job is to translate the instructions into something the firmware understands. So make sure that you have the right driver for the printer that you have and for the operating system that you have, and make sure that the driver is compatible with the firmware version that is on your printer. Now, this is starting to sound really tedious, and I don't expect that all of you are going to go and start, combing through driver pages on hardware manufacturer website to try and find the right one. But I just want to share this to you as an example of why your printer isn't working and what the issue is and why there's really not that great of a solution. There are some universal standards for printing, but a lot of printer manufacturers aren't really incentivized to use those universal standards over proprietary ones, because if you've got a computer and you've got it all set up to work with your Epson printer, great, and then you go and buy a Brother printer and it doesn't work, well, you're incentivized to buy another Epson printer. And so, this closed ecosystem trying to encourage you to stick with one manufacturer because, the drivers are just easier to work on my machine, and so I'm going to use that. It can incentivize manufacturers to not use universal standards. So if your printer is not working, make sure that your drivers are up to date. Maybe update your operating system and get newer drivers. Or if you have the latest drivers, but your operating system isn't the newest or your computer isn't the newest, try using older drivers. See if those work a little bit better. Sometimes new drivers can break something that old drivers allowed. For example, if you're using a Microsoft Word document to print, well, there's multiple types of Microsoft Word documents. There's .doc, which I believe is Office 2003 and earlier, and then there's .docx, which is a newer file format. If you're trying to print a .doc, you might have more luck with an older driver because those ones were designed for printing .doc files. Whereas if you're trying to print a .docx file, which is a newer file format, the newer drivers were designed with those file formats in mind, and it can be helpful to try a newer driver. But at the end of the day, if you're really having trouble and you can't figure it out, download 10, 15, 20, 30 different drivers and just install and uninstall them. Restart your computer every single time. Eventually, you'll probably find a driver that works well enough to just get your thing printed. When you do, print out your report, turn it into your boss, and tell your boss, hey, I need a raise because I've got to buy a new printer. I'm not dealing with these stupid drivers anymore. But, it's just a brief overview of how drivers work and how, what operating systems are and how they can have an impact. Now, lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about ink and access controls. I talked about how ink is a big money maker for printer companies. That's the primary revenue model, is ink. If you see a printer on sale, don't be fooled. You should look at the cost of the ink and how much it's going to cost you per month or per year, and maybe look at operating costs from other people who have used the printer for a couple years and see how much it costs them, because printer companies make their money off of ink. But there's another concept to talk about with ink and access controls, and that's that, we talked about how printers aren't just a piece of hardware. They have processors on them. They have firmware on them. And so, in a sense, printers are computers attached to a printer, or a printer attached to a computer, or a printer with a computer built in. But on top of that, there has been recent changes, or not super recent, but the trend has been towards access control mechanisms on printers. So what's an access control mechanism? Well, if you've ever used a Keurig machine, the little single cup coffee machines, I used to like those things because I was a young professional on the go, and I just wanted one cup of coffee. I didn't want to make a whole pot of coffee and wait for it to finish. Just needed one cup of coffee to get me going, get me out the door. And luckily, I had access to a Keurig machine, so I just pop my little coffee pod in there, my little plastic cup in there, and make my coffee and be on my way. Terrible for the environment to have disposable plastics like that, but it helped save my day, so I moved on. And I realized that the Keurig cups were pretty expensive, and I found a little device that was just a little plastic reusable cup that you could fill with your own coffee. And I thought that was great because I don't like throwing away plastic, and I would like to save money and use my own coffee in these machines. So I put my little refillable pod into that thing, and I'd make my coffee every morning. where I was working, they also had a Keurig machine, and I would do the same thing there. When I would get to work, I'd make another coffee, and I'd just go and start my day. But eventually, that one at work broke, and the idea was, well, everybody uses this Keurig machine, so let's get a new one. So the people at work bought a new machine, and when I went to go make my first cup of coffee, I stick my little pod in there, and I closed up, and it said, "Invalid pod. Please remove." And I was like, what? What do you mean invalid pod? It's a plastic container with coffee in it. This is what you do. You make coffee from a plastic container. So I pop it back out and shake it up a little bit. I don't know, rub it down on the sides, make sure that there's no dirt or something. Pop it back in. Invalid pod. What does that even mean, invalid pod? Well, the newer machines had a little device. It was a little scanner inside the Keurig machine. So when you'd close the machine down on the pod, it would scan the lid, and on the lid there was a specific barcode that would be read by the machine, and if that barcode was there and was validated, it would brew your coffee. But if the barcode's not there, then it wouldn't work. Couldn't do it. Why? Because they wanted you to buy Keurig pods. They weren't making money on these reusable pods. So they wanted you to buy Keurig pods because at the end of the day, if you buy a Keurig machine for, I don't know, $80, $120, some of these were like $500, I'm sure, but some of the machines were cheaper. If you buy one for $80, well, that's just $80. But if you have to buy a $2 pot of coffee every time you want to make one cup of coffee, then you have to pay $2 per cup of coffee. And if you drink 3 cups of coffee in a day, $6 a day, times 365 days, that's a lot more money than just this $80 machine. Your machine will work for 2 or 3 years until you break it. Your pods are single use, and then you have to toss them. And so they figured out that, the pods are really where the money is, and so they figured if we can force people to use only our pods and have a specific barcode that prevented you from using the machine with invalid pods, then we can make way more money, and so we're going to do that. This is not a new idea. Who thought of it first? The printer companies. They realized that, that they were selling printers and they were selling ink, and they made their money off of the ink. No one was going to spend $3,000 for a printer. I mean, would you spend $3,000 for a printer? Of course not. That's insane. But it costs a decent amount of money to make the hardware and to innovate and to build the software and to build the drivers, as we talked about earlier, and to build the firmware. All this stuff is really expensive. The research and development of new technology is very expensive, and it's not being justified by this $80 or $120 or $200 printer that you're buying. Even if you're buying a $600 printer, it probably costs them $1,000 or $2,000 worth of research, to try things and fail, trial and error. And so they need to pass those costs on to you somehow. They need you to pay that $1,000 to $3,000 over the lifespan of the printer in order to justify the cost of research and marketing and all this stuff. They're spending millions or billions of dollars a year on advertising printers to you. Somebody's got to pay for that, and they don't want to pay for that. They want you to. So they said, well, we'll sell the ink for really expensive, and people just won't notice. They won't really do the math on how expensive this ink is. They won't notice that, it's costing, that literally, if you look it up, there's other videos that talk about it, the cost of printer ink is more than the cost of liquid gold. You could melt down gold bars and sell them for cheaper than the cost of printer ink. So what they realize, they have to make their money selling ink, and so they charge exorbitant fees for this ink. And all was well and good until people started figuring that out and saying, well, if I can just get the printer and I can make my own ink cartridges, or I can refill my ink cartridges, I can save a lot of money. If you've seen those syringes on TV where you squeeze it into the ink cartridge to refill it, or you'll see, knockoff brand ink cartridges that are not made by the original manufacturer that are much cheaper because they're just using cheap ink, Now, they're not always high quality ink, but some people don't care about that. If you just want to print something out really simply, then you can do that. And people like Epson realize that, if our customers are refilling their ink cartridges, we're not selling more ink, and so we're not getting that money back, and it's no longer profitable to sell these printers. So they run to their hardware guys and they say, well, what can we do? And the hardware guys go, oh, well, this is no big deal. Just, put a little barcode on there, just like at the grocery store. Put a barcode, make sure it's, authentic product, and if there's no barcode on the ink cartridge, then make it not work. Just tell it to shut down and have it only print if it's got 4 authentic ink cartridges in it, which is great for the manufacturer. Now you can't use knockoff products, and you can have tamper evident solutions where if you're refilling the cartridge, it causes a problem and it will break, or the cartridge is thin material, so it won't last very long. So if you're trying to reuse it, the cartridge will break and get ink everywhere and make it frustrating. So, if you've ever had the idea of, oh, I'm going to buy cheap knockoff ink cartridges, or, oh, I'm an ink manufacturer, let me just fill up my cartridges with my own ink. Well, the Epson is trying to find ways to prevent you from doing that. Is it because they're evil? No. I mean, you could argue, but I don't think it's because Epson is evil. Epson wants to continue to make top-of-the-line products. They want to continue to innovate. They want to continue to be a brand that people look to and say, this is high-quality product, top of the line. But it costs money to do that. It costs money to continuously research and innovate. And honestly, I mean, in America, the trend is supposed to be that, that anybody who competes has a fair shot at succeeding, and Epson doesn't really want other, doesn't want to have these razor thin margins where if people aren't buying enough ink or printers, then they're going to go under. And so they need these devices in order to maintain their market share and in order to continue to make that insane amount of money that they can then turn around and either pocket themselves or more likely, have a higher research and development budget so that another competing company just can't compete because they don't have the income in order to invest in research and expenditures. I don't like to be a cynical person. It may be that just Epson really just wants to make a bunch of money ripping you off with selling ink, but I also think that without these access controls, a company like Epson would have a lot harder time justifying the investment into research and development if their profit margins were not as exorbitantly high. Now, if you're interested in stuff like that, like ink and access controls, let me know down below, because there's a really interesting intersection between this idea of, this idea of ink and access controls, where they just put this access control on because they want to sell more ink. But the flip side is, in America, we have a law called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and this law says that if you break access controls, if you have valid access controls in place and a user breaks those, then you can sue them for, copyright infringement or other sorts of, patent infringement or other sorts of remedies. And, the law defines access control systems in a way that things like these printer cartridges are covered. And so now not only do these barcodes prevent you from buying knockoff ink, they also say that if you interfere or tamper with these access control things, then you can be liable for copyright infringement, which can be, or patent infringement, which is really high damages and very discouraging from users against users who want to try and make things work for themselves. So not only do these access controls prevent the ordinary user from changing this system or getting around this expensive ink problem, they also prevent people who just want to try and figure out a way to, fix it. You might be able to, take the barcode off one ink cartridge and put it on a knockoff one. But if you do, well, now there's legal ramifications against that, which is a whole larger problem. And I think it's a really interesting topic, but this section has really gone on a lot longer than I expected, so I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully, this was a little bit helpful. If you ever run into issues with printers or you've had problems and you just don't understand, why can't it just, Like, why doesn't it just print? I press the print button, just print it out. Don't do anything fancy, just print it out. Well, when you're talking about just print, you're going from your software, like Microsoft Word, and you tell it to print. It sends certain information to your operating system, which could be any number of versions, any number of types of operating systems. That operating system has to process the information and send it through your USB cable, which also has its own protocols and standards and levels, or it's going through your Wi-Fi, which is even scarier because networking is a whole nother can of worms I won't go into, but more issues can happen there. And then let's say it goes through the USB cable. Let's say that it's able to figure out its way, like the information from Microsoft Word went fine, went through your operating system just fine, went through the USB cable just fine. Then once it gets to the printer, it goes to the processor on the printer, and the firmware's got to decode those instructions, and you hope that the firmware works and is fine. And then from there, the firmware has to send the instructions to the hardware, which can also have problems, or maybe it's misunderstanding the instructions, or there could be other smaller pieces of firmware once it gets to the hardware level in order to make it work. And then on top of that, like maybe you have a misconfigured driver or there's a bug in your operating system, and all of these can cause those different sorts of problems where these print errors will happen and you have no idea why. And it's because something went wrong along one of those multiple layers, and it's not always very obvious why. And then on top of that, if your printer just isn't printing, it might not be that there's an error. It might just be that all of those, your program is fine, your file is fine, your operating system is fine, your USB cable is fine, your firmware is fine, your hardware is fine. I'm running out of fingers. But then the issue is ink and access controls. Goodness, this is disorienting. Ink and access controls. Let's say you put the wrong ink cartridge in. You ordered what you thought was a valid ink cartridge, but it turned out it was a knockoff, and you put it in and your printer won't print, and you're just like, what's going on? I've spent hours reinstalling my operating system and changing the drivers and updating the firmware and changing out 10 different USB cables, and it won't print. It's because Epson wants to make more money from you. So, long story long, printers can be a big ball of wax, and they're very frustrating. If you've ever run into an issue with a printer and you've solved it, leave that story down below. I'll give you a round of applause because printers can be some of the most painful things to deal with. And if you've ever run into a problem with a printer and you've just said, this isn't worth my time, I'm just going to go buy a new printer, I feel for you. It sucks, but sometimes that's the answer. And, at the end of the day, if you want to solve problems with your printer, I applaud you, and I think trial and error is the best method. Start learning, start practicing, use the printer as an example, but also know your limits. If you're going to spend 3 or 4 hours trying to print something and it doesn't work after 3 or 4 hours, depending on how much money you make, those 3 or 4 hours might be more valuable to you than just buying a new printer. It might just be worth it to just buy a new printer, because at the end of the day, the real cost of a printer is the ink anyways. So, it might be worthwhile to not spend your time trying to fix a problem that's caused by either programmers who are incentivized to cut corners and save time, or printer manufacturers who just want to make more money, or just a random glitch within your operating system. Sometimes it's just not worth it, honestly. If you've made it this far, I hope you enjoyed. This has been day 7 of 100 Days of Chat, and I'll see you on the next video.